Hi viewers, this is a review of the Leica Q, or Type 116, and it's in my opinion one of the best cameras to be introduced in the last few years, and certainly one of the most expensive. And in this review I'm going to go through everything that I can think of in terms of handling, weight, my experience with it, the pictures, the sensor, and also the menu. And at the end, hopefully you'll see what I like about this camera and also what I don't like, and to help you decide on whether this is the camera for you. Alright, so first of all, let's start with the exterior. So this is a fixed lens 28mm full frame camera, and follows the footsteps of the Sony RX1, and it essentially is in the shape of a Leica M. And what we have here is, in the front, the lens assembly. We have a manual aperture ring right here that you can go to auto, or you can select different aperture settings from 1.7 in third stops all the way to f16. So next we have this ring for focusing, but it's actually normally locked under autofocus or AF. There is a tab down here that if you press this button, then it will unlock this, and then you can move this as if it were a manual focus lens, like most Leica lenses, and it will show you the meter and the feet marking on there. Now the neat thing is there is a macro setting, and when you turn this macro ring, this distance indicator will shift up, and then now you have focusing from 0.3 meters all the way down to less than 0.17 meters, which is pretty close for a 28mm. So this is really cool, and the way they design it is they basically fit the aperture priority setting onto here, the AF/MF setting into this ring, and the macro setting into this ring. So with three rings, they've done what other camera makers have had to use buttons for, and that is great because in the field, you do not want to be fiddling with buttons, and this is all literally at your fingertips. And at the front, we have this Sumilux 28mm 1.7. It's not exactly a Sumilux, it's kind of cheating because it's not 1.4, but 1.7 is kind of an in-between land. It's an aspherical elements in there, and also it's a 49mm thread size like the RX1, which is more than a coincidence. And by the way, this is usually red, this is black because it's been switched out for more discreet shooting. On the top we have the Leica Q, it's engraved. There's the stereo mic, the hot shoe, and the shutter dial. So the shutter dial goes from auto to all these settings from 1 plus second to 2000 minus second. So what does that mean? So in auto, essentially the shutter speed is decided by the camera. But if you go to 1 second, alright, so here we have 1 second right now, and I can use this side dial to change it to longer than 1 second, all the way up to 30 seconds, and then to T, which I believe is bulb. So this is a secondary knob for shutter speed. And if you are in any setting, you can use this knob to switch in a third stop increment of settings between the current notch and the next notch. And for high-speed shooting, once you get to 2,000th of a second, you can use this knob to go beyond 2,000ths of a second, all the way to 16,000ths of a second. Now beyond 1/2000th, it's going to actually switch to electronic shutter, so it's completely silent, but you may run into issues of light flickering or basically things bending to your will, like when you tilt the camera. Alright, so that's the top. We have also the on-off button. Now this goes from off to single to continuous, and actually here I would have much preferred off continuous to single, because oftentimes when I turn it on from off, I switch it right to continuous, but I actually want single, and 90% of the time I want single drive rather than continuous drive. So this is one design mishap I think that should have been prevented before they introduced the product. Now here's a movie record button. You can only do movie recording, you cannot set it to something else, unlike the Sony cameras. And then here's a dial usually reserved for exposure compensation, but does not have any markings on it. And by the way, this is printed, and this I believe is engraved. So I think the top and bottom are aluminum, and the middle of the body is magnesium alloy. So it's not the typical brass metal of Leica M's, and it's definitely not as heavy. So let's continue. On the back, we have the EVF. It's 3.68 million. Oh, there you go. See, when I turn it on, it went to continuous. All right, and back to single. All right, so 3.68 million dot EVF, which is more than most cameras out there, and the picture through there is actually quite nice. The eye relief is not as good, especially for your glasses. Now, here's the screen. It's about 1 million dots as well, and it's very, very clear. It's one of the best LCD screens I've used in the camera. I don't know if it's because of the way they process things, or the screen is just much better, but it's certainly something that I found to appreciate. So on the left, we have 5 buttons. We have play, delete, function, ISO, and menu. And the only button you can configure is the function button, and I'll go into that in a bit when I go through the menu system. And here it says Leica, it's made in Germany, and then we have the D-pad. Now, when you press the middle button, it just changes the view. And if you press the left, right, top, down, it actually doesn't do anything except for menu navigation. It would have been nice for this to change the focus location of the AF box, but hopefully that will be fixed in a firmware setting, or firmware update. So on the right, we have this door, which is plastic and it's kind of out of character, but we have the HDMI port and also the USB port. So, by the way, there is no USB charging on this camera. On the bottom, we have the battery access along with the SD card slot. So it would have been nice for the SD card slot to be on the side, but I guess they're trying to save space here. Alright, so that's basically the camera body. There are lugs here, and then it comes with a leather neck strap, which is nice. So, in terms of the weight, it's about 700 grams. I just measured it. It was 696 grams, including the battery and SD card. And it's kind of hefty, but it's not heavy at all, especially if you consider even the mirrorless setups of Sony A7s. When you add a lens, it usually gets to a kilogram or above of weight. So, things that I like about the Leica Q. Well, the first thing I must say is the lens. The 28mm 1.7 is really superb. It's sharp corner to corner, and you can shoot wide open, unless you need the depth of field, for 95% of the time. The other thing is this camera is really a photographic tool versus the Sony cameras, which I view as photographic computers. And I say that because all the dials are at your fingertips. You can change them very rapidly. The buttons are very simply laid out. They're labeled, they don't have dual functions. And the thing is, the camera is really, really responsive. So when you turn this on, or when you wake up from sleep, it's instant. And it's just ready to shoot right away. No 2-second delay or trying to rack the focus so that it gets itself ready, like some unnamed camera out there. So the other thing is the autofocus is really fast. It's probably one of the fastest I've used on mirrorless or DSLRs. So here's an example. I'm just going to randomly focus on nearby and far objects, and you can see how fast it is with the beeping sound. I'm literally just randomly pressing the shutter button, and it is coping perfectly. So the other nice thing about the autofocus is that it autofocuses really well in low light. So sometimes you have a camera that works well in normal lighting, and then when it goes to low light, it starts to hunt. But with the Leica Q, I've gone to very, very near pitch black situations, and it's still able to focus. It's a little slower, but it can still focus, and relatively accurately too. So if I were to take a guess, I'll say it can focus down to -3 EV, which is the same as the A7R Mark II, and pretty darn close to the A7S focusing capabilities. So now in terms of the autofocus, another thing that is really cool is the touch screen. So this here, you can touch anywhere in the screen. You can set it up in the menu so that when you touch it, it will focus and release. So it'll take a picture wherever you want to focus it on. So for example here, let's say I want to focus on this lens cap. I just press it and it takes a picture. And with a 1.7 lens, focus is really critical because the depth of field is so narrow. And if you can do this, then you don't have to do focus and recompose, which with nearby subjects sometimes can lead you to autofocus pictures. So this is really nice, especially for portraits or when you're using the rule of thirds, where the subject is off-center and you don't want to focus and recompose. Or if you want to snatch something that is more discreet, say on the street, you can hold it at your waist and you can literally point to the subject that you want to take a picture of and it'll take the picture. And of course the shutter is a leaf shutter and it's really quiet and no one will hear it. So again, everything speaks about this camera being more of a photographic tool than an amazing piece of technology. This lens does have optical image stabilization that can afford you 2 to 3 stops, in my experience, of additional slower shutter speed so that you can get some of the dynamic range back. And in my shooting, I can usually go down to 1/5 of a second, and this is a 28mm. So 1/5 of a second is about 2 to 3 stops less than what you're supposed to shoot at. So that optical image stabilization is really working, and at that speed with a 1.7 lens, you're not going to go very high on the ISO scale at all. And talking about the lens, it is a fixed focal length of 28mm, and I'm more of a 35mm shooter, and that's why I like the RX1 series so much. So 28 is actually what's on the marking, and this lens actually is more of a 26mm in real life when you compare it to a normal 28mm. So it's actually wider than it's indicated. So that becomes kind of a difficult tool to do for close-up pictures. One, because you have to get close, and two, because it will give you some distortion when you're that close. So one thing that they've put into this camera that you can do is this digital frame line. So here it's at 28mm setting, and then here it's 35mm. And let me change the setting. Here we go. So this is 35, and then this is 50. So you can still see the whole frame, but when you take the JPEG, it will crop to 35 or 50mm equivalent. Now, 50mm is going to be 8 megapixels, so that's not too useful for most people, but 35 is 15 megapixels, and in my opinion, that's still very well usable if you want to shoot in 35. So you do have this flexibility of using a 28mm lens as if it were a 35mm lens. Now the other thing I want to mention is the image quality. So image quality is really a result of the combination of the lens and the sensor. The lens is just superb in terms of the bokeh, the color, and the sharpness, and the sensor itself is among the best out there. So in combination, it's no surprise that the image quality is really, really good. And Leica also has their signature tweak in their JPEG to saturate the colors more and to increase the contrast, which if you like doing that, then this is exactly up your alley. But if you don't, then you can shoot in RAW, which is in DNG. You don't need any special adapters. And in the DNG file are the settings to tell, say, Photoshop, what the lens profile is so you can correct for distortion. And by the way, if you don't correct for distortion, there is quite a lot of distortion in this lens. So it is electronically corrected, not like the traditional Leica lenses. Also, this camera has Wi-Fi and NFC, and the Wi-Fi you have to pair with an app on, say, iPhone or Android, and what it does is it can remotely control the camera and also transfer pictures from the camera to the phone. Now, I haven't figured out how to transfer just one picture yet, but I'm sure there is a way. But basically, it's a backup for the pictures on your camera into your phone, and also for you to share the pictures right away with your friends. Now, the other thing that I really like about this camera is the battery life. It's about 350 to 400 shots per charge, which is quite amazing for a mirrorless camera, especially with a full frame sensor. It's exceeded my experience with Sony cameras such as the A7 and the RX1 by quite a lot. So that is definitely a plus for this camera. And please excuse me for the fire sirens outside. Something is burning down, but I'm going to continue recording here. And as you can see, the battery is pretty hefty, so this is part of the reason why. And also it's using this Maestro 2 processor, which I'm sure is lower power than the previous generation. So I mentioned all these things that I liked about the Leica Q, especially the responsiveness, the autofocus, the touch screen, the optical image stabilization, the sensor, and everything. Basically, it's hard to name something that I don't like, but there are things that I don't like. And I'll talk about those, and then I'll get to the menu system. So things that I don't like, and you'll find them to be quite minor because there are not too many of them. One is the ISO button location. So this is second one from the bottom, and I would have preferred it to be either on the bottom or the top so that I don't have to feel around to find out which button it is. And the other thing is there is no exposure compensation marking on this dial, and also there is no exposure compensation function in the manual mode. So if you do say 1/30th of a second and then 1.7, then changing this dial will only change the third stop shutter speed setting. It's not going to change exposure compensation. Now this is a feature that's available on Sony, where even in manual you can use exposure comp, and basically what the camera does is it'll change the ISO to make that happen, but not here. And it's just something I'm used to, and it's not available. Again, the on-off button, I'd rather be off continuous single than the current setting. The grip, it does get a little tiring after a while because the radius is not very large and the thumb grip is towards the edge here. So your hand does feel a little cramped, as you can see here. It's not very natural, and I do have another video showing what you can do about that with accessory grips. And also, there's something I mentioned, I would rather prefer the SD slot to be on the side than on the bottom, so you don't have to take it off the tripod mount to change cards. And let's see, no charging on the USB. So that would be really nice for a travel companion camera like this, where you can just charge from a laptop. And finally, for a $4,200 MSRP camera, there's no weather sealing. So that is inexplicable, and I wish they have done that, because this is a camera you'll take with you everywhere, and you don't want a little bit of water to stop you from taking pictures. So that's really the list I have for things I don't like. Alright, and finally I'd like to walk through the menu, and as you can see the menu is not very long, so this won't take too long. So here the first thing is digital zoom, and here it's the equivalent of pressing this button here. You change from 28 to 35 to 50, and in focus menu you can choose single or continuous, and then AF mode. Right now I have touch AF plus release, and you can also get rid of the touch function by choosing one point or multi-point. There's also tracking, which works relatively well, and here there's the AF assist lamp, which I usually turn off. And for MF assist, you can choose whether to auto magnify or have peaking or have both or off. So if I am in, let's say, manual focus mode, let's do this. So as soon as I do that, you'll notice that the camera automatically magnifies, and that is really helpful. So let's go back to the menu. Exposure compensation, there's the metering, the typical settings, bracketing. Continuous shooting, you can choose between high, which is 10 frames per second, or medium and low. So self timer, 2 or 12 seconds. Flash settings, which I typically don't use. Optical image stabilization, right now it's on. You can turn it off if you put it on a tripod. And under scene mode, usually it's PASM, but you can also make it full auto when you hand it off to someone who, maybe not as professional in taking photos as you are. And then there's sports, portrait, landscape, night portrait, fireworks, and there's panorama, which is nice, and time lapse. Under time lapse, you can choose the intervals and the start time and so on. So this is included in the scene mode. So then there's the white balance, And photo file format, you can choose JPEG or DNG plus JPEG. You can't have just DNG. And in terms of JPEG resolution, you have these settings, and I'm sure most people will stay at the default setting of 24 for the 28mm, 15 for 35, and 8 for 50mm settings. And then under JPEG, you have different color managements, and here under saturation is where you can choose this monochrome mode if you want to shoot in black and white. But there really isn't too many settings that suggest color filters for black and white, so it's very basic. And then here, video resolution, you have 1080p, 30 or 60, or 720p at 30. They don't have 24 frames per second, which means you should not use this really as a serious video tool. And under video settings, you have a whole bunch of things here. And since I don't shoot video, obviously, I'm not going to go through these in detail. Acoustic signal, you have things you can change to affect the sounds that key clicks make, or AF confirmation. And here under auto ISO, there's a trick here. So the max exposure time is really the slowest shutter speed you want it to hit, and then it will start expanding the ISO. So right now I have it set at 1/8 because I'm pretty comfortable shooting at this speed with the stabilization on and still get a sharp picture. And then under max ISO I set at 1600. And right now, if it gets really dark, it'll go from 1/30th, 1/20th, 1/10th to 1/8, and then it'll start bumping up the ISO. So effectively, this is similar to other cameras where you can set the shutter speed at which ISO starts going up. So this is really useful. It's a trick that I use for this camera so that I get to really take advantage of the stabilization and then reduce the ISO as much as I can so I don't have noise or have less noise in my picture and more dynamic range as well. So highly recommend it for you to test this out. Maybe 1/8 is not the right setting for you. Could be 1/4 or 1/30th, who knows. But for me, with OIS turned on, 1/8 is the best setting. Auto review for JPEG reviews, power savings, and then function button. In live view, you have these settings that you can use, and probably white balance and file format are the most useful here. And the zoom lock button, that's this black button right here, you can use for digital zoom, or you can use for locks for focus or exposure. And then display settings, you have 2 sensitivity settings for the EVF, and I have it on low, and auto rotate and LCD brightness, they're different settings. There's no auto brightness. And live view setup, you can turn on things like the level gauge, so that's really to see if your photo is straight. There's the grid, clipping, and histogram. So these are all useful things. Usually turn them off. Now under playback, you can also show clipping and histogram. And then language and HDMI output, and under format is basically formatting the card. And then there's camera information, user profile. Here you can save profiles into 4 slots. So it's kind of like the memory function of certain cameras. And then there's the Wi-Fi setup, and here you can name the Wi-Fi connection and set the password and do other things to enable you to connect to the phone. So that's it for the menu system. So now we're near the end of the review, and I've basically mentioned a lot of things that I like about the Leica Q and a short list of things that I don't like, and went through the menu with you as well. So basically, inside and out, this camera is a really good photographic tool, and I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to basically just take pictures without inhibition, without a computer standing between them and taking the picture. Everything is super responsive. You will not miss many pictures with this camera. Now, the only thing preventing everyone in the world from using this camera is the price, and it is very steep at more than $4,000 introduction price. But one thing is you could wait for it to go down over time, or you could say that Leica doesn't depreciate very much and use that as an excuse to get yourself a Leica Q. But it is certainly I would say almost worth the price. And is it 4 times better than a $1,000 full frame A7 camera? Probably not. But in terms of would you just have this one camera and be satisfied with it, then the answer is probably yes. And it's hard to say that for any other camera out there. And the irony is this is a fixed lens camera, and I'm saying that, so it is that good. So this is really the review, and I hope you're not totally bored by now, and I hope it's been of some use to you. And as always, please like the video if you enjoy it, and dislike it if you don't, and please subscribe. I will see you guys next time.